Apologies, that took a minute. I think I'm next. And I just want to acknowledge all the labor that went into this amazing session today. And it's really an honor to be here among people and organizations that I consistently learn from. So just really deep gratitude. I'm Erica Miners. I work in higher education. I'm a professor at a public university, which supports a degree program in a prison, and a university that's always been an institution of necessity and of choice for formerly and now currently incarcerated people. I've also collaboratively built programs for access to education for people inside and outside of prisons. I'm speaking today also, in addition to as a professor, also as an abolitionist and as a feminist, as a member of the Prison Neighborhood Arts and Education Project, and also Critical Resistance, and other organizations that have worked for decades to redefine safety and to end our reliance on the prison industrial complex. So from these standpoints, to respond to the really smart question I was asked about accountability, in my next 7 minutes, I'm going to make 3 points that quickly situate a context. I want to reframe the question I was asked, and then I want to offer just a couple of fast or concrete examples, particularly for those who are listening who are working in the field of higher ed. So the 3 points to situate my thinking. First, education and prison are in an irreconcilable tension or conflict. The definition and practice of education that I engage and the communities that I'm a part of invoke is about freedom and liberation and supporting people and communities to flourish. Orlando talked earlier about Paulo Freire, and I just want to re-echo that. So this definition and practice of education is fundamentally in tension with the project and the purpose of a prison, which is focused, of course, on premature death. So the goal of our higher education and prison work or our work at a university is not to reconcile this tension or pretend it doesn't exist. I think we're actually smarter and more adept if we acknowledge it and organize anyway. And if we see the work of education as supporting the obsolescence of prisons. So that's my first kind of context that I want to flag here for this conversation about accountability. My second point in terms of context is when I consider accountability in this context, it's such a, it's got such a corporate spin to it. I want to recognize layers to that conversation, and it's not unidirectional. I mean, of course, one layer is how is our higher education in prison program accountable to people inside to deliver quality, meaningful programs that they want and merit. I think that's a, kind of a non-negotiable. But I think our accountability is also multifaceted. People inside don't simply want a fabulous education. They want the same things the students in our free world classes want, a flourishing and wonderful life and love and connection to community and healing and opportunities. So how are we accountable for supporting people's flourishing futures that don't involve a future of incarceration? I think that's one of our accountability measures as well. And also because we know that most currently incarcerated people become formerly incarcerated people, and accountability can't stop when people are not in prison, right? How are we ensuring the openness? And we had great conversations about access already this morning or this early afternoon, depending where we are. And I think, yes, that these are enormous questions about accountability that we're talking today. But just as in my free world classes, I support the futures of all of my students. And the exciting thing about there being so many issues is that there's so many places for us to collectively organize, to work to dismantle, right, to work to change, and also to work to build. So I think my second point there. My third point that I wanted to raise about contexts is, and for those of us who do this work, what I know firmly and what I have learned over the years is that policies might be necessary, right? But they are never sufficient. So policies might be necessary, but they are never sufficient. We know both in the site of the prison and the university that policies often have very little impact on practice. Or, of course, even policies crafted with the best of intentions can be weaponized against the very people that we thought, or some thought, that that policy might protect. So I'm not saying that policies don't matter, rather they are not our organizing goal, and we got to be a little cautiously skeptical. So those are the 3 points about context I just wanted to make before I reframed the question I was asked, is that prisons and some universities present this unreconcilable tension: punishment and liberation, punishment and education. Second point I wanted to make was that accountability is multiple and shifting and layered, and it extends beyond simply delivering quality programs, however we might define that. And the third point that I wanted to raise is that policy might be necessary, but never sufficient. So now I want to return to the beautiful question I was asked and just reframe it. And I'll just put in the chat, oh my gosh, do I know how to do this? I know how to do this. The question I was asked, and I just want to reframe it. From what policies and processes are in place for ensuring higher education programs in prison are delivering results to students? What's missing? I might reframe that to how do we develop, and I think it sort of fits wonderfully with the conversation already we've been having this morning and all the brilliance of the folks that have preceded me. How do we develop always expanding collectives of people to support radical learning inside and outside the prison and the university, learning that both holds the capacity to render the prison obsolete and to transform the public university and our communities? So not at all, not a small order, but I think an important one. And the spoiler alert answer to that question is, of course, there's no one right pathway or one right response to that. I think for those of us who are in higher education or have some, tether to higher education, I just want to close today by offering just some places to start or to strengthen or deepen on our campuses. And to start this layered work of fostering accountability. Just 4 quick ones. I think I have 2 minutes left. Form collectives of people to study. Beth talked about the insufficiency of doing work alone. Form a study group to read Beth's Arrested Justice book. It's wonderful. Read the Underground Scholars work. Read Danny's recent report. Read the work of the Alliance for Higher Education in Prison, Project Rebound. Engage this work and support it. Number 2, there's many things, but I'm just drawing 4 here. Number 2, learn from folks already doing the work in your location. Your location matters, right? Usually it's family members, currently or formerly incarcerated people, many of whom we've heard from this morning already. Find out what they're already doing and how you can support and amplify this work, right? Given that the prison industrial complex impacts poor people, Black folks, queer folks, non-citizens, these are the experts, right? So, how do we do work on our location to figure out who's already doing the work? How can we amplify it? How can we learn from it? How can we support it? That's not, I think, key. Number 3, I wanted to offer work to develop trust and right relation with the people, and communities. And this is not an overnight process, as we're thinking about accountability here. Higher education continues to do active damage to systems, to many communities, including and particularly systems impacted people. That box on every application. So acknowledging this harm is a prerequisite to trying to build any relationship. So I think accountability is not, an overnight thing. Got to acknowledge that higher ed continues to do harm. How do we move from there? And then the last idea I'll offer today is to audit your campuses, right, with a critical abolitionist and feminist lens. Is the budget for campus policing larger than the budget for mental health services for students on your campus? Does your campus have the box, asking about criminal records histories to access employment, admittance? Who is agitating for debt relief, free post-secondary education in your community, on your campus? The work of higher education in prison is, of course, at the site of the prison, but it's also at the site of the public university. So there's so much I could have said about accountability, and I know I talked a mile a minute, but I just wanted to offer those as provocations for us today. And I want to just thank you for this amazing conversation and all I continue to learn from the folks on this call. So thank you.
Hello. I hope everyone. Hello. My name is Romarilyn Ralston. I want to start by saying thank you to Ed Trust for hosting this important conversation around equity and access to higher education for those with histories tied to the criminal legal punishment system. We know the American criminal punishment system has over 2 million of our community members locked away in federal, state, and other types of carceral cages. Held within these spaces are our nation's most marginalized and vulnerable populations, such as women, who have been the fastest growing incarcerated population since the 1980s, transgender folk, who suffer incredible acts of violence at the hand of the state while in prison, and of course, the most disproportionately groups who are behind these walls are Black, Indigenous, and people of color, who are often poor, undereducated, invisible, and marked as disposable. However, and more importantly, within these obscure communities are passionate leaders, tenacious workers, and brilliant scholars who do come home. In California, the state prison count is over 99,000 across 34 facilities, and among them are approximately 13,000 students enrolled in community colleges or other higher education programs. The sheer number of incarcerated students in post-secondary education programs indicates a clear desire for the transformative power of education. If 95% of incarcerated people return to their communities, and we want to decarcerate and rid our world of these failing and grossly expensive institutions of punishment, more access to quality post-secondary education that leads to degree pathways are important. We know that punishment and prisons are not the answer to our society's social problems. The strongest predictor for recidivism is poverty. The strongest predictor for poverty is lack of education. As educators, providers, and advocates, we can make a difference by demanding education policies that influence and offer socioeconomic mobility to our most forgotten and marginalized. This is what accountability should look like. If we truly want to reduce recidivism in our states, decarcerate, and elevate community accountability to new heights, I believe higher education is the link. Since 2014, incarcerated people in California have had access to community colleges through the legislative power of SB 1391. And this year, we expect Governor Newsom to sign into law Senate Bill 416, which will ban the box to higher education for incarcerated students, basically placing guardrails and university accountability to provide quality education, if possible, in-person instruction, access to academic counseling and resources while incarcerated and post-release. Senate Bill 416 will also prioritize college programs and create counseling services that will connect students when they come home. Mass incarceration is rooted in policy, and it will take, I believe, policy to remove a lot of the barriers to accessing post-secondary education for justice impacted people. What we can do to hold the state and public universities accountable to removing barriers to higher education for justice impacted people are, in my opinion, hold them accountable, hold administrations accountable for prioritizing the best education that they can offer folks who are incarcerated. So if you have a prison education program and you're going inside of facilities and institutions, make sure that you are bringing the best that you can possibly offer to us inside. It is that important because you need to prepare those incarcerated students for campus learning post-release. We need to be prepared for the rigors and the competitiveness of college academics and culture when we transfer into public and private universities. We must insist that parole and probation acknowledge all levels of higher education as rehabilitative and include college and university study as a bona fide parole plan. We should educate the public, and especially those who we elect to serve us, about the benefits of post-secondary education for incarcerated and previously incarcerated people by raising awareness and providing education to people in power and the community about the overwhelming success rate of individuals with an incarceration experience who have chosen higher education as the way to undermine these revolving door policies that have caused mass incarceration, systemic racism, and continue to drive generational poverty. As educators, providers, and advocates, we have a responsibility and accountability to ensure that justice-impacted people who desire to attend on-campus college and university programs post-release have that opportunity to do so, regardless of their crime or time. This may mean establishing formerly incarcerated student programs, scholarships, housing support, and a number of supportive services, including creating a safe space on campus for students with an incarcerated experience to meet with their peers and build community. There should be university policies that take into account justice, equity, and the unique needs of students with an incarceration experience and other challenges that they face. We must not steer or suggest to students with an incarceration experience that they choose majors that pose no resistance, but that they are able to choose majors that they are passionate about, that will help them not only to learn and to engage with the materials, but to really go further and do more for the community. They should not continue to be held hostage by their past. We should challenge discriminatory practices at every level that bar or create barriers to degree pathways, internships, practicums, licensure, and other certifications by banning the box to higher education nationally. We can also teach legislators and university administration that higher education attainment leads to better health decisions and greater access to employment opportunities and financial resources, and has a positive impact on psychosocial factors. Higher education policy for incarcerated and previously incarcerated people is possible. Public and private funding for students with an incarceration experience is possible and attainable. Every day I see the power of higher education as the program director for Project Rebound at Cal State University, Fullerton, come to fruition. As justice impacted people and as a justice impacted person, I have benefited from the power of education every day in my life. And now I get the opportunity to show others of how this opportunity can help change their lives and their community. Thanks to the work of California State University Project Rebound Consortium, the University of California Underground Scholars Initiative, and California Community Colleges Rising Scholars Network, we've been working on systemic change here in California this year, asking California to ban the box. We are really close to having SB 416 pass into law. And we know that this will be a model for other states to follow. And so I just ask you all who are on this call today looking for a way to make, I think, systemic change within your states for formerly incarcerated people and justice impacted people to access higher education, to reach out to us, and we can help provide you with the information to help make this happen for you. The CSU Project Rebound Consortium envisions a just and equitable world in which all people, including those with an incarceration experience, have access to high quality education and comprehensive student support services that foster achievement, transformation, empowerment, social responsibility, and flourishing. Now, Project Rebound's motto is supporting the higher education and successful reintegration for the formerly incarcerated. Justice impacted students are some of the most tenacious scholars on our 14 campus programs. And we have seen not only their academic and social transformation through their grit and supportive communities, but also by challenging systems of oppression to see us and recognize our collective power and commitment to liberation. Accountability is something that we should all hold each other to for making our community stronger and healthier. I'll end with this quote by Nelson Mandela, who said that education is the most powerful weapon one can use to change the world. I know this to be true. I live it and I see it every day. Not only does education change the world, it changes everything. Thank you so much for your time today. And thanks to the community on this call. I learned so much from you, and I appreciate all of the work that we're doing across this country. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. Kim Hunter-Reid, Commissioner of Higher Education here in the state of Louisiana. Delighted to be with you today and certainly appreciate the comments made by the previous speakers on our panel, who are exactly right when they talk about the importance of learning from those doing the work, the incredible resource that we must bring to bear when it comes to educating those who were justice impacted, and why it matters when we think about accountability and success, and how we measure that and how we think and talk about that, how important that is as we move this work forward. So to the question about how do we make sure that state policies, state agencies are ensuring that higher ed programs are accountable to those in prison. First, I will make a couple of points. One, I think we as certainly state agencies here in Louisiana, the Board of Regents is the state's coordinating board. We work with our public and private institutions and proprietary schools as well. We set the state vision for talent development. And so I would say prioritizing the population is very important. Elevating the importance of talent development for justice and formerly justice involved individuals is critical. Advancing policy and practice to serve individuals well, and measuring how we're doing, and then understanding the ground game, analyzing what's working, what's happening, where we are, and continuing this idea of continuous improvement, asking tough questions, talking to individuals who are benefiting from our programs, making sure that you understand what's happening and how to use that information to continue to advance good work. I think that's at the heart of what we do. So how do we do that in Louisiana? I'll share a bit about the work. In 2019, we set a strategic plan for our state. The strategic plan is called Louisiana Prospers, Driving Our Talent Imperative. It includes this chart, which I talked about today with my board. It talks about today's students and talent to be developed. All of this talent is important to our state, and the talent on this chart here in Louisiana includes traditional K-12 to post-secondary students, first in the family, foster youth, veterans, and incarcerated and formerly incarcerated. So I think it's important as your state is setting visioning documents, strategic plans, that nested within that plan is an acknowledgement of the importance of justice and formerly justice involved individuals, and that they represent talent to be developed in your state. And so we set that strategic plan in 2019. Today, we gave our 2-year report to the board on how we are doing with increasing educational attainment in Louisiana, addressing barriers, moving student success forward. So I think that's important, to acknowledge the value, to acknowledge the importance, to recognize and say to these populations, we see you. You are critical in our vision for success, for a more vibrant, more prosperous state and country. Finally, and next, I would say that it is important that we bring talent developers together to actually execute against the plan. So it's not just that we have a shiny document and it goes out to our board and stakeholders, the governor, legislators, but that the plan is operationalized. And so after we set our strategic plan, the governor developed workforce education sub-cabinet. So within the sub-cabinet are the talent developers. Some people call us the social determinant panel. So we have, of course, K-12 and higher ed at the table. We have workforce and economic development at the table. We have housing and healthcare at the table. We also have juvenile and adult corrections at the table. And so we talk about the populations we serve, the barriers to success, the policies and practices that matter, and how do we, as talent developers for our state, bring to bear good data and information? How do we use that to inform decision making? And how do we share resources and leverage and braid resources across our agencies to really advance the work that we want to do when it comes to making sure we're moving people from poverty to prosperity in our state. And as has been shared, this focus on reducing recidivism and trying to make sure that we understand that the national statistic, I believe, is that 85% of those incarcerated will be heading back into their community. So how you advance back into your community is at the heart of the work that we are talking about today. And that is our calling, to make sure education and training opportunities exist for all, and that we have equitable, accessible, affordable opportunities that allow individuals to have a strong education to employment pipeline and the kind of social mobility that really helps them to support themselves and their families. So these are not just about numbers for us, these are about people. This is about strengthening our communities, our families, and our state here in Louisiana. And I think that approach to the work is very important. I would also say understanding the ground game is important. So we have about 2,700 incarcerated individuals who are participating in high demand education programs each month in Louisiana. I learned about that by visiting our facilities, talking with the education lead for the Department of Corrections. I understand we have over 100 industry-based certifications. I ask questions about the training programs. I understand that the most successful are welding, automotive repair, and forklift operations. I've talked to individuals who have hired our formerly incarcerated individuals as well. Our Department of Public Safety and Corrections understands that this is not an exercise of just getting high quality education to individuals. The real end game is around employment. And so we're working to make sure we're connecting industry to prison talent when it comes to apprenticeship, work release programs, virtual job fairs. Our Department of Correction is working on building a reentry workforce portal. They have that underway, and I know in New Orleans over 30 companies have availed themselves of the portal, and so they've posted job listings, they've sent messages, they're interviewing potential talent. And so understanding what's happening on the ground, I think is very important when it comes to collaborating and advancing good work. I certainly know that there is much more work to do. There are people who have been at this work for some time and are passionate about it and understand the value of having the Pell Grant available, the value of understanding how to get beyond the box, the value of making sure that industry partners are at the table, helping to develop programs that make sure individuals are workforce ready for that first job and the job after and the job after, that the wraparound services are there for them as well. I visited a facility and had a chance to visit with some scholars behind bars and just talk with them about their programs. I asked the question, why is education important to you now? And they talked about the value. They talked about what it means to be in school, but also talking to a family member or a child who's also in school, showing that it's important and what it means to their families. And just last week, I received a letter from one student letting me know he finished his associate degree, but that he also had formed a nonprofit to help to spread the message and pay it forward to other individuals, other young people, to let them know that education is important, that education and training makes a difference. And he reflected on the question that I asked and the conversation that we had, and shared that it really had led him to this point of really thinking about how to pay it forward. And I would say so many individuals that I meet that are pursuing education in behind bars are passionate about the work, passionate about sharing their learning, excited about getting out and continuing their education and pursuing the kinds of careers that allow them to help others to see the path forward and to have a more prosperous reality. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to join this conversation. I thank Ed Trust, who's been a phenomenal partner with us here in Louisiana on a lot of work, important work, for bringing us together today to talk about issues that matter, to learn from each other, and to ask important questions about how we're doing. How are we accountable? How do we make sure that there's continuous improvement and that the education to employment reality is strong and that it's continuing to improve as we move this work forward? So delighted to be with you, and that concludes my report.
I do it once a day on a Zoom call. Didn't think I was going to do it here, but I started speaking without taking myself off mute. But I want to thank all of the presenters today for very, very insightful and very important comments. But I want to begin by framing and just quickly stating that accountability really means making sure that the investments that are being made by the public, by the state, by the federal government, by students, that these are being protected from fraud and abuse and ensuring all students have access to high quality education. Accountability also means investing in colleges committed to providing access and opportunity, being transparent about what is happening and taking action against programs where earning a degree may be rare and may be unlikely to pay off. And so the comments provided by our three panelists, I think, really pushed us to think about that. And I want to highlight really quickly some of the major points that were made. Dr. Miner's perspective, experience, and work challenged us to explore the tension between higher education and punishment. She pushed us to acknowledge and discuss this tension, to explore how higher ed in prisons need to be accountable to students in the program, but pushed us to consider that this accountability doesn't end when students are no longer in prison, but it continues and extends. And so how do we measure and how do we think about that? Dr. Miner urged us to remember that policies are necessary, but not sufficient, and that these oftentimes could be weaponized and require skepticism from our part. And so it really pushed us to think about how do we develop maybe not the policies, but maybe the context which we allow accountability to be more dynamic. Romarilyn highlighted the impact, the attributes, the strengths, the qualities, which we have witnessed today of those that have been impacted by the criminal legal system. Additionally, she pushed for policies that offer socioeconomic mobility, policies at both the state and institutional level that provide the necessary wraparound supports to things like access to academic resources and counseling, and finally push for high quality programs to be implemented, that institutional policies be implemented, and that administrations be held accountable for ensuring that quality. And then in our final flash talk, Dr. Hunter Reed centers some of the work, the really good work being done in Louisiana at the state level. She pushed us to measure the results and analyze the ground game to engage in continuous improvement, discussing the importance and the role of the state on including and acknowledging both formerly and currently incarcerated individuals as part of the talent in the state that should not only be invested in, but also be developed. Additionally, Dr. Hunter Reed highlighted the role and importance of cross-sector collaboration, strategizing, and data tracking to ensure that all sectors are coordinating across the state and ensuring they're serving students in the best way possible. And I'd say finally, Dr. Hunter Reed pushed on the importance of understanding the what was happening on the ground in these programs, examining the role of these programs and leading to employment and to economic mobility, as was discussed in Romarilyn's statement. And so I want to thank you all, and I want to welcome all of you back to the stage and engage, so we can engage in a brief conversation. I want to start with my first question, and anyone feel free to take it, is how do we ensure accountability? How do we hold programs accountable without penalizing students?
Well, I would certainly say that obviously the value add for the student is in the program delivering on the promise. So, I think we penalize students when we don't know the value of the program. We penalize students when we give them whatever is the most convenient program as opposed to the most high quality program. When we give them the program that is yesterday's economic need versus tomorrow's economic need. So are we offering cyber and STEM, or are we offering upholstery? I mean, these are the kinds of conversations that matter. And I think for us, asking real questions about what's the utility of the program, what's the quality of the program, in that conversation, I think you lift the importance of the students. And so that's where I think the real conversation is. The question is not just how do you do it and not penalize, how do you make sure what you're offering is not penalizing the student?
I agree with that. And in that same, vein, what we do here at Project Rebound and across our 14 campus programs is that we center our students. Our students are not formerly incarcerated people; they're students. So we insist that they receive the same resources, the same respect, and the same access as any other student. They have gone through the same processes as other students to enroll by completing the CSU Apply application. They pay the same tuition. Therefore, they should have the same respect and the same access. So this is how we hold folks accountable on our campuses and across the CSU, just by simply making sure that they're not treated like incarcerated people. They are free. They have been liberated. And they are using the transformative power of higher education to not just change their lives, but really to change the culture of our campuses.
I'll just add that, here in our work in Illinois, building power is really important. I see the question in the chat as well about holding Department of Corrections accountable.
Can you address that question? Because I was going to ask it.
Yeah, I think that is an ongoing labor and process, and it's so great to hear from state officials like Dr. Hunter Reed. So I think that is really, an ongoing process here in Illinois, and I know in many states. And I think Romarilyn, in her presentation was just really reminding us of the work to organize, to base build, to make connections, to become, a community that can hold these systems accountable and can push these systems. But, we can't, as, individual actors, as individual people, as a lone faculty member, I think that's where communities, as Dr. Ritchie started us out with this morning, communities, collectives, networks, organizations, base building. I mean, the only way we're going to push is to have a well-educated. I also just want to lift up Romarilyn's point about educating the public, right? Doing horizontal political education. Many of our organizations that are working on criminal legal issues, often haven't, thought specifically about access to higher education for people inside or after release. So educating, both horizontally organizations that should be doing this work or should be thinking about this work, and educating higher ed, educating the public. So all that to say is I think that the only way we have any potential of doing this work is organizing and building a base and organizing collectively. So thank you.
I don't know if anyone else wants to address that question around how do we hold prisons accountable, and not just higher ed.
I'll just add to that. Thank you, Erica. Wonderful, wonderful answer. What has worked for us here in California is by going directly to elected officials, directly to legislators, to senators and assembly people who we can hold accountable, who can hold CDCR and the governor accountable for these laws and policies, who can then shift resources and funding around to make sure that all Californians, that all people, especially those who are most vulnerable and marginalized, have access and have equity. And so I think it's really important for all of us, who, and for all of us to, number one, voting is so important, but to hold those people who we vote for and don't vote for accountable to all of us.
I would just add to that, show up. I can remember I've been a little over 3 years in this position. I've asked about a prison education program, called the Secretary of Corrections and said I'd like to visit the facilities. And he met me, and I met with students, and I talked with faculty, and I made some recommendations about expansion of welding programs and others, and said, hey, do I need to help fundraise on this, or will you do it, or should we do it together? We got the expansion of the programs, and he said to me afterwards, we're getting the work done. Our education director wants to meet with you frequently in your team, and you are the first commissioner of higher ed to visit our facilities. So if you want to know what's happening, you got to show up. You walk around, you visit, you ask questions, you find out what's going on, and you ask, what can I do to help? How can I support? How can I be part of a solution? What you can't do is sit in your office in the state capitol and opine about what's happening. What you must do is get out there in the field and find out what's happening.
I want to thank you all, and I think that ties into the previous conversation we just had around the importance of advocacy. We know that, as Dr. Hunter-Reid said, that knowing, getting involved in the ground game means showing up, but it also means advocates getting involved in pushing not only the programs, but the prisons themselves to be better and do better by their students. And so I want to thank everyone, all of the panelists today, for joining us and for such an engaging conversation. I want to kick it back over to Kayla. Dr. Elliott.